Podcasts are more popular than ever, not only across generations, but also across countries, races, and different backgrounds. And you may be asking yourself, okay, people are listening. Great. But where are people listening? When are they choosing to listen? And how can I create and optimize my podcast for consumption and growth? That's exactly what we're going to be talking in this episode of the podcast space. And I'm Ana Xavier, a podcast marketing expert that's going to break down this into takeaways that you can implement on your show, but also make you think about what are your audience's behaviors? Because as we know, audiences vary. Let's dive right into this episode of the podcast space. If you're listening to this podcast episode in real time, then you know that it's the beginning of June, the summer's coming along, and you're thinking, should I be releasing podcast episodes? Or maybe you're taking a break and looking to optimize your processes and understand a little bit better how audiences behave so you can meet your listeners where your listeners are and just keep everybody happy. So I'm going to be looking into two things in this episode. I'm going to be looking into the Podcast Consumer Report by Edison Research. This was released in May, so about last month. And I'm also going to be looking into these really cool fan study that Spotify for Podcasters released, the 2023 podcast edition. Now, I want to make a little bit of a caveat. So some of these reports include data from the United States, where I am based, where the majority of my listeners are. But I also want to let you know that every country normally tends to have research about the listeners in your country. And some of these reports actually highlight different consumer habits as well. So these study by Spotify for Podcasters that covered the fan study, I thought was fascinating. And I actually released some graphics back in the beginning of the year because I don't think enough people understand when people seek new podcasts, when people are looking to kind of refresh their content library, but also how you can optimize and market your podcast in a way that captures these new listeners. Now, of course, some of these data is specific to Spotify, but I think that is healthy for us to think about looking at data and think about how does our audience behave. And so when looking throughout the year, podcast consumption will vary. And what they did was look at a graph and look at consumption. And they looked at data from 2022 because, of course, they're still working on the 2023 one. But they said that the months we are supposed to have new listeners coming through are in very specific months. So January, March, July, and October. And these months are the ones that kind of coincide with specific times in the year. And that's also like what they're talking about is seasonal events. So, of course, the beginning of the year, think about how our listeners and ourselves as well, how we behave. We think, okay, it's the beginning of the year. Maybe I want to learn into something. Maybe I want to kind of refresh my knowledge on something else, whether that is, work related or that's about well-being, or maybe we realize that maybe we haven't been as plugged into the news as we wanted. And so we add a lot of new podcasts to the catalog. This is also the time when we look back and think, you know what? These podcasts that I've been listening to, it's just not where I am at right now. So I'm not going to be listening to that, but I want to pick something that's going to replace it. And that's going to be, maybe with a commute, especially here in the United States, as more and more hybrid work has been transitioned into in the office work. So that means that our listeners are going to be having a ton more of a commuter time again. And that means that it's great news for podcasting because I'll have more time to listen. So going back into this graph, so we talked about January. Now, March is a really interesting one. So when we're looking at March, and this is of course depending in where you at, but thinking about the Western way of looking into things, there's a lot of either conferences that are happening in March, but also it's when spring happens. And I was reading a few things about this in the beginning of the year, where the calendar year, as nature resets and everything, it's more around like the spring and March So, actually, if you think about it, if you look outside, that's when everything starts growing. And so, when we are coming out of winter, we also feel like maybe we went either too hard in the beginning of the year and we're like, I want something different. Or that's when you feel like you have more mental capacity because maybe you had the end of the year was so intense that you spent basically January and February just catching up. And now that's when we move into March and we're thinking, I want to look into something different. So, also looking into July and October. So, July tends to be when, for most of the Western world, we're looking at summer and our listening habits and our behaviors change because it's summer. And if you have kids, maybe your routine changes, or maybe you get to the summer and that's when your client load decreases a bit. This has been the case for me from basically for the past 3 years of working here at the podcast space. Summer tends to be a bit slower. So that's when I kind of like when I'm looking at my routine, I'm thinking, I could add a few different shows, maybe do some market research for other things. So that's when I'm looking at changing my behaviors. Maybe the type of podcast that you want to listen to is something about like different mindset, or you want to learn more because again, just thinking about how your audience lives and kind of like understanding why people come to you, what is this listener profile will help you understand why they're looking for new shows. And then going into October, so we're getting ready for almost like the last push, the last quarter, right? So we're looking at that last section of the year. Maybe you looked in the year and you thought, well, I haven't been doing as much as I wanted, or maybe I'm looking at my goals and there's so much that I still want to do. So those are the months that people really look into changing their behaviors as well in like the seasons. Now, if you're thinking about growing your audience or launching a show, that's why if you did, I think that it was Alex and Filippo that did some research about this from Podmatch and PodPros. He has like a gazillion companies. But they did some research and they realized that, again, there's space in the United States, so we have Thanksgiving and Christmas. And if a show is released in November, there's very high chances that that podcaster is not going to be making it because it's just a really rough time in the year to get new listeners because everyone is just business is crazy and people are trying to get through that like last bit of the year. So in terms of acquiring new listeners, it's going to be a little harder to push for new listeners to join your show. So let's move into something else. And that is, how do we capture these people if they are out in the world, right? They are people who use social media, who use websites, like who use Google and AI. How can we get them to jump on our show? So thinking about our marketing, when we're looking at this, we're thinking, okay, so what type of content am I creating? If you're creating content that is directly for your current audience, then they may not feel like they resonate with it. So it's time to create content that would capture new listeners. So it's important to remember that if you're creating content, and people will fight me on this, but when you're looking at your analytics, and this is why it's always so important to look at the analytics from your social media, where are people finding your content? It will tell you where. Using hashtags about the topics that you're talking about, it's still the best way to capture new people into your world and then convert them into podcast listeners. So if you haven't, make sure that you're using hashtags that are about the topics that people would be searching for, and making sure that you're actually creating content that is self-contained. So basically people understand within 2 seconds what it is that you're talking about on that post. You're not making them think too much about what it is. And then last but not least, if a platform is saying that, hey, we are prioritizing this one type of content and this is how you get more visibility and new followers and new reach, then do it. Stop putting your foot on the ground and saying like, I am not gonna do this. Like at the end of the day, you're gonna be the one who's gonna be kind of hurt by that decision. So let's make sure that if a platform is telling us, hey, we're going to prioritize this type of content and this is how you can grow, let's get into the bandwagon. I'm not saying scrap whatever you had, but just implement a little bit, maybe save one day where you're actually doing what they say. And then last but not least, talk about your podcast. I see so many people assuming that people who follow them on social media, people who are on their newsletter, people who go to their website, that they know they have a show. It's important that you promote your podcast. Once a week, promote your podcast. And it's so silly, but it's so easy to get new listeners. I will always say this because when you start saying, hey, subscribe to my newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, if you look at the analytics right within 24 hours, you will see a growth. Like, you will see growth from talking about it. It's just as simple. Like, what is the consequence about talking about your products and services? It's sales. It's not sounding salesy, it's selling. Just the same thing as podcasting. If you want more listeners, talk about your podcast. And in terms of cross promotion, that's the same thing. You also want to make sure that you're looking at cross promoting content with other creators. So if you had a guest that you already remember that they were so great about sharing content, this is the time to maybe release a teaser about a previous episode that you did with them. Try to, of course, like make it related to that, but make sure that you're tagging people. Tagging does work. I feel like a lot of people forget that they just tag the person on the text and they don't tag them on the image. Try to do those two things. And you can do that on LinkedIn as well and on Facebook, TikTok as well. So just make sure that you're allowing new followers to find you through tagging other people. And then lastly, on the podcast itself, let's make sure that we are creating show notes that are a bit more thorough. And if we have the podcast on our website, we're also including the references on the website. If you just put one line about, if I'm doing only one line on this episode and saying, I'm talking about how listeners behave and how you can get more listeners, like, it's not going to be as thorough as if I go through and explain what people will get out of the episode and some takeaways and some stats that are going to be powerful in making sure that people, when they find the content on Google, they go, interesting, let me hit play. So this is just one of the many things that you can do depending on your strengths and depending on where your audiences are coming from. So that's, again, analytics are your best friends. Now, still on the Spotify for Podcasters study, how do people listen throughout the week? So audiences, according to this study, listen to podcasts more often during the weekdays. And that is also when most people release podcast episodes. Let's be real. If you are a small business owner or if you are a hobbyist, you probably don't want to leave the promotion and the scheduling for the weekend. You're going to be doing it throughout the week when you're working. It just makes sense. So that is going to also influence when people listen. And so many people talk about like, oh, when's the best time to release a podcast episode? Well, when you're looking at the data, if you're just purely looking at the data, you're going to see that when you release an episode, it's when people listen. But people do tend to listen on the weekdays. And when on the weekdays? So according to the study, only 22% of the listening happens on Saturday and Sunday. However, I thought it was really interesting. Throughout the week, commute time are prime for podcasts, of course, as I mentioned in the beginning. So listenership spiking between 8 a.m. and, again, 9 a.m. and then 5 p.m., which is when most people leave the office. And so on Saturdays and Sundays, podcast consumption spikes between 11 a.m. and noon with smaller upticks in the evening. So again, of course, people think about like, how do you live your weekend and how does your ideal listener consume podcasts? I thought it was really interesting that they actually made a differentiation between education and wellness related genres and how they peak in the morning, and entertainment and family content is more popular in the evening. Again, why? Because people who are listening with kids, or they listen all together. Maybe they're cooking, maybe they're getting ready for doing whatever all together. So that's so obvious when you're looking at data and you're mapping that out and thinking like, why are the numbers here? And more often than not, if you ask your audiences on social media, what are their listening habits? Well, guess what? They're going to tell you. So, if anything, if you are not too sure, ask them. Something else that I thought it was interesting is that when they're talking about video podcasts, comedy comes up top with 27.55%, followed by society and culture, 12%, and business, 10%. So it's if you are a small business owner or a business owner or a professional who's trying to get more prominence online, definitely know that video podcasts are captivating audiences. And again, think about how people behave. YouTube is growing, and Spotify for Podcasters just released a feature for everyone to upload content on the back end. So if you have a video podcast, you can go in the back end. However, it's important to know that as of right now, and that's the second week of June, they just released this, they say that the video downloads are not going to be counting toward your analytics dashboard. So to me, it feels like it doesn't make sense because if you can't get data to understand what people are listening to and what they want, it's not going to help you make decisions down the line. Okay, so it's time to move back to the Podcast Consumer Report by Edison Research. And a couple of things that I just wanted to let you know that are good to just think about. You don't need to get this data for anything else other than just like, okay, what can I do strategically in terms of my marketing and my content planning that can kind of, with this new information, help me succeed. All right, so in the beginning of the episode, I talked about how listeners are spending more time than ever with podcasts. So in 2014, so 10 years ago, people who are over the age of 13, they said that only 2% of their time was spent with podcasts. In 2024, that number went up by 4 times. So it means that 11% of their daily time is spent with audio. And again, as I mentioned earlier, as commutes in the US now continue to grow because of a lot of people moving into back in the office or the fully remote to a hybrid model, we're going to probably be seeing that grow again. And what I thought it was really interesting is that 23% of weekly podcast listeners spend 10 hours or more listening to podcast every week. What this means is that if you're saying nobody is listening to me, you have to ask yourself, how are you not promoting the podcast effectively? Or are you actually not giving any value to these maybe 20, 30, 50, 100 people who are listening to your podcast? Because when we're looking at the data, it says that people are spending an insane amount of time listening to podcasts. And who is listening? So it is all across generations. So they're looking at people from 6 to 12, 12 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus. All of these people, all of them, and the lowest number is 27% of people, which is in the age of 55 plus, they say they are listening to podcasts every month. And also, it's diverse and increasingly female. So this study also saying that 48% of Black Americans and 43% of Latino Americans are podcast listeners. And of course, this is looking into the US data, but 45% of women are monthly podcast listeners and 32% are weekly podcast listeners. So again, everyone is listening to podcasts. And this is so important for business owners. So podcast listeners are a highly coveted audience for advertisers because they tend to be more educated and with higher income. So when we're thinking about creating podcast content that is going to further our business, well, people who are decision makers are listening. Because we just know if you look at data online, leaders are increasingly listening to podcasts because most people want to be educated. So it means that also 46% of weekly podcast listeners have purchased a product or service as a result of hearing an ad on the podcast. So feel free to talk about your products and services on the show. People are okay. Now, if it is a 3-minute ad, people may be a little annoyed at you. So make sure that you're optimizing the ad for podcast listeners. Make it fun. Make it part of the podcast. So much so that in a way, people don't realize that they're being sold to until you talk about the product and service. So take some time to think about how you want to market the product that you have. Okay, so we are recapping this podcast episode about consumer behavior and podcast listeners' favorite times to listen. So let's go back and just quickly recap. So, when are people listening? They tend to listen throughout the weekdays, Monday through Friday, with 78% of the consumption taking place during those days, and only about 22% on the weekend. If people are listening, they tend to be listening throughout their commuting times, starting at 8 a.m. and then jumping in again at 5 p.m. So, of course, looking into the months of the year that listeners look for new shows, it does ebb and flow throughout the year. So, the best months to get new listeners are January, March, July, and October. So, if you want to run ads throughout those months. If you want to do strategic partnerships, do it during those months too. Seek and invest time in creating online strategies, marketing strategies, social media strategies. They're going to organically help you find new listeners. And then, of course, talking about podcast consumption, let's not forget that people are listening to podcasts on a weekly basis up to 10 hours a week, and that people all across ages are listening to podcasts too. Women, Latino, and Black listeners are listening to podcasts as well. So if you're struggling to find your ideal listener, it's just because you're not marketing it to the right audiences, or maybe you have just no idea of where to start. Well, guess what? I do that. Let's work together on growing your podcast influence and making sure that you're growing more listeners and that you understand your data and why it isn't growing, or maybe it is growing and you have no idea that it is. So you can visit thepodcastspace.com/services to find out how to work with me, because I work with podcasters of all sizes. And if you are an impact-driven entrepreneur who wants to create lasting change, that is exactly how you do it, by investing in your own podcast. So as we are getting into the summertime, of course, we want to make sure that we're maximizing those July listeners. If you're listening to this not in real time, well, you can always work to optimize your organic discoverability and get a podcast that is bingeable and retains listeners. Not only gets and acquires new listeners, but also retains them. So if you're looking to grow, let's talk. I am Ana Xavier, and don't forget that you can always talk to me if sending an email or sending an inquiry on the website feels a little too scary. Well, let's chat on Instagram. Follow me. I'm at the podcast space, and send me a DM or give me a follow. I'll also include a few more podcast episodes on how to grow your listenership and on how to optimize your listenership to double your downloads with minimal effort. Because let's be honest, in the meantime, we can always learn and implement quick strategies to help us grow our podcast. So, let's chat on the Instagram, and I will see you in the next episode. Keep creating imperfect content that moves you forward.